All right, welcome back to our prayer studies.
Yep.
We have been doing these for a little over 10 days now.
Yep.
I think 10 days. This will be starting our next what do you call a 10-day period? A decaday, something like that. All right, so we're looking at a prayer today. We are looking at Jacob asking God for a blessing and kind of making
Bit of a
a
covenant.
kind of a covenant, kind of just kind of a contract with God about it. And so we're looking at Genesis chapter 28 and verses 20 through 22. And this one is a little different because of the way that it's laid out. But this is, of course, you may remember the story of Jacob traveling, and he comes to this place and he lays down to sleep, and he sees a vision of the stairway going up to heaven, and the angels are going up and down. And then he sees the Lord, and the Lord talks to him, and then he speaks back to the Lord about it. He names the place. Verse 19 tells us he calls it Bethel, which is the house of God. And then he names God El Bethel, the God of the house of God. So that's real original. But
Yeah, it seems kind of redundant as well.
the
It's like,
God of the
okay,
house of God
this is God's house, and the God whose house it is the
is God,
God of the house.
the God of the house of the God. Yeah. So
Aaron.
but in fact, anytime in the Bible that you see the word Beth in a word, it's going to have something to do with house. And most of the time, if you see El, it's going to have something to do with God. There are a few exceptions to that, things like Jezebel, which ends in El, but it's really Baal. So she was actually named after Baal because her family was, you know, heathen
Bad
idol
people.
worshippers. Yeah.
Bad
But
people.
but a lot of times when you see El, you've got Israel is the one who wrestles with God, and you've got all through the Bible you have a lot of El terms. But Bethel is what he names it. Used to be Luz. In fact, at the time he was there, it was called Luz. It's an interesting case in verse 28 here of kind of an anachronistic terminology where he calls it Bethel
Verse 28.
in chapter 28, sorry, in chapter 28, where he calls it Bethel, even though it wasn't known as Bethel yet. Uh,
Yes.
so, so there, and he actually talks about it as being Bethel earlier on in Abraham's day. He calls this place Bethel, even though now when Jacob comes there is when it gets called Bethel. So Abraham wouldn't have known it as the name Bethel. He would have known it as Luz. But anyway, so Jacob makes this vow in his prayer. He makes a promise to God. If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go. In other words, keep me safe, protect me, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace. Then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone, remember he set up a stone and called it the house of God, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. So,
Reminds me of the genie.
a genie in the bottle.
Like, phenomenal cosmic power, itty bitty living
You're going to
space.
live in this little rock right here. Yeah, no, I
Yep.
don't. Of course, we know God didn't live in the house that Jacob set up for him, but it is, it's certainly an interesting. I mean, you got angels going up and down a staircase, and then he sets up a little house and says God's going to live in that little rock right there.
Yep.
Uh, a little strange, certainly a little strange. Um, so an odd circumstance altogether with Jacob and God having this conversation. And what's interesting, this is actually Jacob's prayer is actually kind of in response to the promise that God makes him. In fact, if we go back to verses 13 through 15, we see that promise made
Yeah.
that I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. And now this doesn't mean that Abraham is Jacob's father. Isaac, of course, is Jacob's father, but your ancestor. And he says, I'm going to give you this land to you and your offspring. Your offspring are going to be like the dust of the earth. You're going to go to the east and the west, to the north, to the south. You're going to spread everywhere. And all the families of the earth are going to be blessed in you and your offspring. And again, Paul, of course, takes this as referring to
Yeah.
Jesus coming, that offspring, that seed. But he says, I'm with you. I'll keep you wherever you go. I'll bring you back to this land. I'll never leave you until I have done what I've promised you. And so that's what led to then Jacob making this promise. Well, if you were going to do all those things that you're saying, then I'm going to respond in this way.
Yeah.
It's kind of an odd circumstance. And God does. He says, if you bring me safely again to my father's house in peace. And he does that. If you go down to Genesis 32 and 33, Jacob goes back home.
Yep. It's fulfilled there.
Yeah. So there is the fulfillment of God doing his part, protecting Jacob, giving him an abundance. And what we don't have recorded anywhere, it's Jacob's part of it.
Is Jacob filling his side? Yeah.
Yeah, we never find a place where Jacob gives the tenth. How would you give God a tenth of all your stuff anyway?
I don't know. I still kind of think that the Levites have something to do with
That
that.
he say,
That
God says,
that
okay, I'm going to take a tenth of your offspring as
that
mine.
Jacob was like, well, okay, God, you do this for me, and I'll give you a tenth of like everything. And then God's like, all right, I want that kid.
How about that kid and all of his kids? That
Yeah.
that's my tenth, and then all the other kids are going to have to give me a tenth of their stuff too.
Yeah.
But, yeah, and certainly a lot of this, obviously, we think money a lot of times when we think about giving to God
Okay.
a tenth of, or whatever. But
But you got to keep in mind in the New Testament when Jesus is talking to the Sadducees and Pharisees, and he says, "You tithe the mint and the cumin and the anise, like these tiny little herbs that
yeah,
you've got in your herb garden that most people would forget about. You make sure that you give exactly 10% of those. You measure each leaf and you count them out and everything, and you tithe your leaves. But and goes to show that it's not just money in
yeah,
those
oh
days.
yeah, and of the cattle, they would give a tenth of their sheep, and as well, really, it winds up being a lot more than a tenth what they gave under the old law. Now, Jacob promises 1/10. But under the old law, there certainly wound up being a lot more because they had to give the offspring, the firstborn was God's, and they had to give a tenth. So, that starts to add up
Yeah.
depending on how many offspring a particular sheep or cow or whatever has it.
Yep.
It can certainly add up. But it is interesting. They gave that, but Jacob probably would have. How do you give it to God? There weren't any priests for him to give. I mean, Abraham, Melchizedek, but there wasn't exactly a lot of
Well,
priests hanging around for.
considering what we hear from Hebrews about Melchizedek like never dying, who knows? Maybe the guy was still
Yes,
around.
he may have been around. Uh, but I think it's probably a good chance too that Jacob saw himself fulfilling this by offering sacrifices. So I think Jacob probably offered a tenth of his cattle as a sacrifice, as a burnt offering to God.
Yeah.
And it's very possible that he thought he filled it that way. But again, the Bible doesn't record his fulfillment of this promise, so we're kind of left just guessing as to how he did it. But it's kind of interesting that, God has already promised he's asking him, if you'll be with me and keep me safe and give me food and clothes and bring me back home to my father's house safely, then you're going to be my God. God's already promised him that in verses 13 through 15 before he even asks. And it kind of reminds me of Isaiah 65:24. Before they call, I will answer. And while they're speaking, I will hear. God's already answering our prayers before we even voice them. And he certainly did that with Jacob. We might not expect him to come verbally and us hear him say these things like Jacob heard him say them. But it is a pretty amazing thing the way that God will answer our prayers, give us things that we didn't even know we needed,
Yep.
and give them to us. And then we're like, oh, wow, I needed that. I didn't know I needed that. And you've provided it already. It's a
Yes.
wonderful thing. So, other thoughts? Anything
Um,
jump out at you?
think that's about it. Of course, when we talk about, God giving us things that we don't realize we need. Makes me think of the verse where it says, "The Spirit is an intercessor for us with God,"
Yeah.
and tells us with groanings too deep for words that um, the Spirit is a very touchy subject. And this video is not going to get into
Right.
that. We'll
About
have
that.
to deal with that.
I'll do that some other time.
Yeah, some
We
other
have a
time.
series on the Holy Spirit sometime.
Or we'll probably touch on him a bit more on his
Well,
role in prayer,
in prayer, yeah.
with this series. But just the fact that a member of the Godhead knows what's going on inside our heart and is talking to God the Father saying, hey, this person needs this person wants this, all this stuff,
Yeah.
when even we don't know.
Right. When we can't even put it into
When
words.
we don't
Yeah.
have the words for it. And
Yeah.
there have been plenty of times where I'm just like, God, there's a lot going on. I don't know how to say everything that I need to get out, so
Yeah.
just
Don't know how
you'll
to
take care of
explain
it.
what I'm
Yeah,
feeling.
yeah,
I don't know what I want. I don't know what I need. I don't know what's
mhm,
best in this situation, but just help.
yep.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's good to see that God can do things like that.
Yeah. And does do things like
Does do
that.
things like
All right. Well, we'll see you next time. Hope you enjoy this lesson.
that. Yep.
And remember, God's always listening, and sometimes He hears you before you ask and answers you before you even call for it.
But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't call for
No,
him.
still called. Jacob still did call, even though it might have God knew it, but he still asked for it anyway. All right. So we'll talk to you next time. Have a good day.
Bye.